My name's Ken Kilbride. I'm from ADHD, and you're very welcome. If he just give us 30 seconds, wait till everybody comes through our digital front door, sits down, has a cup of coffee, gets ready, and we're ready to go in about 30 seconds, 1 minute. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ken Kilbride. I was saying I'm from ADHD Ireland, and I'm joined today by Timmy Frawley, who's an associate professor in mental health nursing employed by the UCD School of Nursing. He's registered with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland as a psychiatric nurse and nurse tutor. He's head of subject with the mental health nursing and is a member of the University Neurodiversity Working Group, as well as an elected member of the Academic Council. We're also joined by Emer O'Reilly, who is a project officer in the Equality and Diversity Inclusion Unit, where she leads the Athena Swan program in UCD. And she's managed a number of EDI subgroups, including the University Working Group. I'm also joined by Sandra Connell, who's very important to us and has been very vital to us in getting the report. And she's a research assistant in the School of Nursing. And in the background there is Beth, who runs everything for us. And without Beth, nothing would actually happen. So in terms of the little bit of history of what's happening today, I would have joined ADHD Ireland approximately 7 years ago. And at that stage, I was recommended to contact some people in UCD, as they had been great supporters of people with ADHD here in Ireland. As part of that, we developed a partnership, and very early in 2019, we started running in-person conferences. The first conference we ran was in the Law Society on neurodiversity and the criminal justice system. For the next 3 or 4 years, we've been running conferences online on criminal justice, mental health, other areas of interest, the third level sector for people with neurodiversity. As part of those series of speeches, we've been able to attract world-leading speakers such as Simon Barrett-Cohen, Judy Singer, Professor Lawrence Fung, Damien Milton, and lots of other people you'd know who would be seen as thought leaders in the area. Out of the conferences would have grown these masterclasses. So as part of the masterclasses, what we were doing, we said, look, we have all this information, but we want to keep this information alive and relevant. So as part of that, we started doing these masterclasses, which run once a month. And again, we're inviting world-leading speakers to talk at them. But as part of that, we've been doing an awful lot, forgive me, talking around ADHD, neurodiversity, and other conditions like that as well. But then someone may actually put to us the challenge, what are you actually doing in terms of walking the walk around neurodiversity? And so again, we have been working hard in the background, and we thought it was very relevant in terms of this series that we have been doing for this neurodiversity masterclass series. So again, we have a presentation today on making University College Dublin a neurodiversity friendly campus, the research findings. And to lead this off, Timmy's going to give us a presentation on the results that were recently published and brought forward to UCD. So hand it over to you, Timmy.
Thanks so much, Ken. And indeed, special acknowledgement to ADHD Ireland and indeed all of the non-governmental partners who would have supported this work and this project. And I know they're listed here in the slides. So it's lovely to have the opportunity to speak and to be joined, of course, by Emer and Sandra, who are also integral to the project, as indeed are you, Ken, and Beth, too. But of course, the project lead, Associate Professor Blana Gavin, who is on leave, can't be here this evening. And it's important to note that none of this would have happened without her. But it goes without saying that there's a large team that we'll bring you through in a few moments. But we're just going to describe the different strands of the research we undertook, exploring how the campus here in University College Dublin could be more neuro-affirmative or neuro-inclusive. And we looked primarily at, I guess, the experience of both staff and students, because oftentimes when we think of the university, we think of our student population, and of course we should. The student population are what the university is there for. But of course, universities and colleges right across the globe are also major employers. So we do need to think about how employees are supported as well. So we'll take you through the research, and we'll bring you through these slides as quickly as we can. And of course, if you have any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function. So Beth, if you'd like to proceed. Briefly on the next slide, we'll show you a very brief overview. Of course, you'll all be familiar with neurodiversity. Beth, if you'd like to continue on. So as we have learned from our own experiences, our own education, and indeed wider media, and of course this Masterclass series, neurodiversity encompasses a wide range of experiences. All of which are represented within the university setting. Next slide, please, Beth. But one of the features about neurodiversity, as we know, is that very often these experiences will travel together. So, of course, a person can be autistic, or of course, a person can be dyslexic or dyspraxic, or any of the other experiences for that matter. But often there will be an overlap. And sometimes people may have more than one neurodifference or experience. And this certainly is something we find in the university setting as well. Just noting a book edited by David Pollock from which this diagram is taken. Next slide, please, Beth. So why were we eager to do this work in UCD? Now, it's important to note that there are several universities all across the world who are doing this work, notably Stanford University in the United States, but also Dublin City University in Dublin, and of course the Atlantic Technological University as well on the west coast of Ireland. But what we see really is that, thankfully, due to equality legislation and other initiatives and culture change within society, there is more access now to higher education for all people, irrespective of background. And this is a good thing and something to be celebrated. But there isn't much or sufficient robust data on the outcomes of people from diverse backgrounds or diverse experiences coming to university. But there is evidence to suggest that some people are having suboptimal outcomes, particularly in terms of program continuation or program completion. And how we can support people to successfully complete their programs is important, because from a socioeconomic perspective, even from a healthcare perspective, people's outcomes are generally improved the further they go in education, and the greater the opportunity people have to graduate. It can impact all types of outcomes in life, from financial through to health, as I mentioned. Next slide, please, Beth. So I've already just mentioned the Stanford Neurodiversity Project, and Professor Lawrence Fung is a tremendous advocate and champion. And Stanford actually have a conference, a yearly conference, which is online. It's usually later in the year, and I'd encourage people to check it out if you haven't already done so. Next slide, please, Beth. So again, I've already mentioned some of the challenges around the experience of people who are neurodifferent in university. Attrition rates are typically higher than neurotypical peers, and there can be co-occurrence of mental health illness. Now, we know that all people can experience mental health illness, but sometimes mental health illness may accompany various neurodistinct conditions, in the sense that people may experience different types of disadvantage or even discrimination, which of course may have an impact on a person's self-esteem or a person's self-concept. So I think we can appreciate how anxiety, depression, or other mental health illnesses may experience some spike in the neuroatypical or neurodifferent community. So we need to look at what supports can be targeted specifically in higher education. There is, of course, good evidence to suggest that outcomes can be good if students are well supported in their studies. And notably, in our work, we noted that mentorship at critical junctions, at key points in a person's education, can make a difference. So, mentorship and also peer mentorship can be important. What are the critical times in a person's university journey? Well, clearly starting a new program at the start of the academic year, but also targeting additional supports around examination time. This time of year, or actually a little bit earlier, the beginning of May or April, depending on the university or college, exam time can be stressful anyhow. The availability of reasonable accommodations can be uneven from a global perspective. So, of course, how can we target peer and also other mentor-led supports at those critical times of examination and during those times and periods of change? Next slide, please, Beth. So we named our study Making Your UCD a Neurodiversity Friendly Campus. We were fortunate to gain some funding from both UCD itself and other sources, and we'll acknowledge our funders towards the end. We had a large research team, and of course, our external advisors are important to note, from ADHD Ireland to Dyspraxia Ireland, Autism Spectrum Association of Ireland, and Dyslexia Ireland. So we were very fortunate to have that input. And of course, as mentioned, Beth Kilkenny, project support, and Sandra Connell as research assistant, very, very key members of the team. And then on the next slide, you will actually see the range of people who would have worked on this project across the university. So there would have been faculty, there would have been students, both undergraduate and graduate students, student union representation, estates. And I think it's important to highlight estates just as one example. The university isn't simply about the teaching and learning approach. The university is around the built environment, the virtual environment, the ability to avail of quiet spaces, the ability to avail of low stimuli environments if needed. So having estates, and as we see professionals from a range of schools, from psychology to architecture to the School of Mechanical and Materials Engineering, medicine, nursing, you name it, having all of those people involved is key. And a shout out as well to Emer and her colleagues in equality, diversity and inclusion. We also had champions within the senior university leadership. And I think it's important to have champions at the executive level of an organization, as well as a ground up approach, but having champions at the executive level is really important if change and development is to be implemented. Just looking ahead, we get into what we actually did in the study on the next slide, a little overview of the program. We aim to explore awareness and attitudes of UCD students and staff, to explore the availability of appropriate supports, to undertake a stakeholder analysis, really, of the campus, both acknowledging the strengths, but equally having a focus on the opportunities inherent. Next slide, please, Beth. So very briefly, there were 5 stages: a scoping review, and then there was a survey, there were semi-structured interviews, and a sensory audit. And also there was a stakeholder analysis of current provision in UCD, led by Emer. So just on the next slide, the scoping review, we see the team leads, and again, the aim. A scoping review, as people here may know, is a type of review of the literature which follows a structured process. Arksky and O'Malley, I think, would have outlined a process for undertaking a scoping review. And on the next slide, we'll see a little bit about the methodology. It follows a series of guidelines called PRISMA, and using various databases, I think we use 6 for this particular piece of work. We looked over previously published research and studies, initially from 22,000, just over 22,000 publications, and 60 papers were included in the final review. And then the next slide, please, Beth. So that's just the PRISMA flow diagram. And moving on to the next slide, we saw that a majority of studies were actually from the USA, but many other countries represented as well. And the range in years was from 2021 all the way back to 2007. Just the next slide again, please, Beth. And we can move on to the next slide. So one of the I guess notable aspects of this scoping review was that there appears to be a lot of focus on autism, and then secondarily ADHD. So a majority of papers focused on autism, and then in second place, you might say ADHD. And other experiences were less documented. And perhaps this is something which should be of some concern to us, because we know that people with other experiences as well can experience disadvantage. Dyslexia, for instance, is coming to mind for me just now. But looking at our findings, there was evidence to support peer mentoring and social support, therapeutic interventions, strategy instruction, so helping students to look at strategies to manage social situations. And I believe looking at how universities and campuses can provide a range of different types of social interaction. Because of course, during Freshers Week, there can be many large social gatherings, but for some people, these are very difficult to participate in. People of all backgrounds have different understandings of what a social situation might be, and how universities and campuses can provide different opportunities to engage socially is important. Teacher training, knowledge and awareness. So in universities where there might be large cohorts of students, sometimes over 300 students in a class, how can the educators be aware? How can the educators, sometimes a large team of educators, all be on message as to how an individual student can be supported? Is there scope for bespoke packages to support individual students? And also the concept of reasonable accommodations. These tend to vary across jurisdictions and across universities. So a one-size-fits-all approach may not work. So how can accommodations be modified to the individual student? We did note that some of the data was of low quality, difficult to make comparisons between studies. There are a lot of different theoretical underpinnings, a lot of different intervention hours, for example, in relation to peer mentorship. Peer mentorship varied perhaps from 1 or 2 hours support all the way up to much higher numbers, 30 to 40 hours support. So it is difficult to make comparisons when there is such heterogeneity in the variables. But certainly the role of mentoring and coaching programs was emphasized, both professional-led and peer-led. That was something that came out strongly on the scoping review. Flexibility as to the pacing and intensity of social engagement. So one of the things that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, many people found the COVID-19 pandemic to be isolating. But in the case of some people, they found it to be rather helpful, because the ability to study flexibly uh, from the comfort of one's own home without having to necessarily attend university campuses where there was a lot of noise intrusion and there was a lot of acoustic insult, if you will. The opportunity to study perhaps on one's own terms and in the comfort and sanctity of one's own home was helpful for some. And as I alluded to a few moments ago, the pacing and intensity of social engagement. So, for instance, you might have in the university campus, you might have oversized Jenga, or you might have oversized chess. And you could have two or three people playing the oversized Jenga or the oversized chess. And there might be an opportunity for onlookers or people to watch on and observe. Now, that for some people could be a very meaningful type of social engagement. Maybe have a quiet chat, maybe watch the game as it unfolds, maybe have some interactions with the other people watching, and then perhaps retire home for the evening. So that might be an example of a differently paced and a differently intensive type of social engagement as compared to perhaps a barbecue with loud music playing in the background. So we see that there is an opportunity for universities to provide flexible and different types of social engagement so that everybody feels welcome and not excluded. And similarly, when it comes to learning, how can we be flexible in the approach to teaching and learning? And by the way, this doesn't just simply relate to neurodiversity. This relates to people with caring responsibilities, be it young children or maybe older adults, people who may be experiencing financial difficulties around the cost of travel to the university campus. So the question is, if we are to be inclusive, I know we're specifically talking about neurodiversity this evening, but if we are to be inclusive, we need to keep in mind that not everybody can present themselves at 9 a.m. to a lecture theatre housing more than 300 students. That's just not suitable or practical for everybody. Um, so the need to raise awareness of university staff. Many university systems are electronic, but does the message around accommodations necessarily get to every teacher or tutor uh, when you might have multiple teachers or tutors or faculty working on a course or module? So does the message get through to everybody? And in fact, fortunately, there has been much greater societal awareness around neurodiversity over the last decade, but not everybody necessarily is on the same page around that. So universal design is something which many universities have embraced, but again, there is an opportunity for bespoke, individualized accommodations, study modes, and curricula. Next slide, please, Beth. And the next one again. I'm going to speed up a little because I know I'm somewhat long-winded as I go through these points. Uh, this piece looked at the staff life cycle by mapping the staff journey. It looked at policies, processes, and strategies. There were stakeholder interviews, and there were, as I say, focus groups with UCD employees. Next slide, please, Beth. So we see that in terms of applications for jobs or employment with university, just over 3% of applicants self-declared that they had a disability. And on the next slide, we see, however, that in 2023, just less than 77% of UCD employees identified as having a disability. So it's interesting to note that the number of people identifying as having a disability is greater than the 3% who might be applying for jobs in the first place. And of note, learning, remembering, and concentrating, I think, is noted to affect just under 20% of people. And on the next slide, We see some findings from the staff journey. So again, for people who are involved in recruitment panels, and I know on the Masterclass series, we've had speakers looking at recruitment and interviewing. Perhaps more can be done around recruitment and interview panels and making the interview process more accessible to people who identify as neurodistinct. Of course, it's worthwhile saying, having sat on interview panels myself, I know that this university already does a lot, but of course, there's always opportunity for growth. The HR partners and other senior partners availed of neurodiversity training workshops, making all employees aware of the existing reports is important, and also enhancing mentorship programs. And I know as an employee myself, I noticed that the mentorship programs have received significant investment over the last 3 years. So there's a lot of good work happening. On the next slide, please, Beth. We see for students, we see that a number of students would be identifying as having ADHD, quite a high number identifying with same. In terms of autism, and I noticed that the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual phraseology is used here, which I respect. Not everyone may appreciate, but these stats are taken from a central resource. Autism is experienced by just over 300 students, and in specific learning difficulty, 903 students. So it appears that neurodivergent students are the largest cohort of students with disabilities or who identify as having a disability who are currently engaging with the Student Disability Service. Next slide, please, Beth. So in terms of the student journey, students reported that the Access and Lifelong Learning Centre in UCD was a very significant support. And students actually spoke very highly of that. Again, there was some suggestion that additional staff might be needed. Such was the diversity of experience across the many schools and colleges. And just looking at the next slide, Beth. So some of the recommendations included increasing resourcing, embedding neurodiversity in existing university training programs for staff, such as the Teaching and Learning Certificate provided by the Teaching and Learning Unit, which is very popular, and also developing a student-led society for neurodivergent students. I'm sure we'll all agree that societies and clubs can be very powerful and are a key aspect of the student experience. So I think that's an important recommendation. Just looking ahead again. A survey was undertaken and a study-specific questionnaire was developed. And this was disseminated both to staff and students. It's important to note that the survey is a non-representative sample. People self-selected. So of course, when people self-select, people choose to partake, and people may have their own reasons for partaking. So they may be more motivated, if you will. So therefore, it's non-representative of the entire student and staff population due to that. But nonetheless, just on the next slide, we'll see that there were I think it was over 700 responses, if I'm correct. We disseminated it through various channels across the campus. And then, 747 responses, with a majority being students, but a reasonably even split. Just looking ahead again, Beth. A majority were familiar with the term neurodiversity, which was good. Looking at the next slide, Beth. So in some respects, there were different views on areas such as disclosure. People had different experiences of disclosing. The majority found it to be a positive experience, but some people were perhaps reluctant to disclose their experience of neurodiversity for fear perhaps of being viewed differently or maybe being treated differently on account of that. Just looking at the next slide, Beth. We see that a majority of people had a previous professional diagnosis, with some having self-diagnosed. Next slide, please, Beth. And I've said a little bit already about staff and student disclosure. Again, the majority of people, when they did disclose, they said it was overall a very positive experience. But again, many people chose not to, as I say, for fears of being treated differently or perhaps receiving a negative reaction. Just the next slide again, Beth. So, as I mentioned, for students, actually, it seemed to be almost easier to avail of supports because the Access and Lifelong Learning Centre and other support structures such as student counselling were very, very clearly signposted. Clearly, staff and faculty also have very good supports available, such as an employee assistance program, human relations supports, direct line manager supports, but sometimes these aren't necessarily as evident as the supports that might be available to students are. So that was something which was notable. Just looking again to the next slide, we have a number of quotes here, which people may be interested to look at when the recording is sent on. It's interesting, some students from North America found that their diagnoses were out of date, if you will. Perhaps people had received a diagnosis in their early teens, and now perhaps as a graduate student in Ireland, the paperwork was considered to be out of date as it was more than 5 years old. And this, of course, created challenges due to the sometimes expensive nature of attending for private assessment. Next slide, please, Beth. And of course, it is the case that some people did also have unpleasant experiences or found that they felt perhaps they were not approached in the right way, or that some faculty responses perhaps lacked empathy. So it's important to look, I think, not only at the individual factors behind that, but the systems level factors that could actually improve that. Next slide again, please, Beth. And again, for staff, sometimes people found some delays perhaps in having accommodations made. But again, I would say that overall, people found that formal disclosure was beneficial to them. The support services were actually keenly spoken about in relation to students. Having a good student advisor service, student counselor service, and access and lifelong learning is important. For staff, having equality, diversity, and inclusion, human rights-based approaches, a good human resources, employee assistance program, and a range of other supports, as we can see, is important. Just moving again ahead, please, Beth. So we noted that various reasonable accommodations were valued. Just moving ahead again. And unfortunately, both staff and students did worry that disclosure of neurodifference could affect their career progression. So that is something which is worrying. Again, this is the perception of the people who completed the survey. There's no suggestion that people are actively being discriminated against or anything like that, but certainly the perception and fear of this happening is something which people experience. Next slide, please, Beth. Again, when you receive the recording of this, hopefully you'll have a chance to read through some of these quotations. Next slide, please, Beth. The qualitative interviews, again, the lead here was Deirdre O'Connor. There were 37 interviews, 16 students, 21 staff. And looking ahead, we see here the process by which the interviews were analyzed. Next slide, please, Beth. So we see here just a diagrammatic representation of the teams which arose, and I'll briefly speak to this, and then we might move ahead to the final sections. So the obstacles which people spoke of were stigma, the challenge in getting a diagnosis, the challenge in accessing a diagnosis, and then perhaps minimization of the difficulties which people might experience. And even today, I was speaking with colleagues actually from the second level or secondary school system, and they spoke about experience of their children's challenges being minimized. So perhaps this is something that people experience, something which people fear. Then in terms of mobilizers, having an understanding approach from peers and from managers and from faculty and staff, having flexible approaches to teaching and learning, accessibility, embracing innovation as well, technological supports. And then in terms of the destination, people were interested in how, progress could be sustained, and the importance of continuing the dialogue around neurodiversity. So just on the next slide, we'll move through the illustrative quotes just in the interest of time. And then finally, the sensory and virtual audit led by Blonid. And this was co-produced, and a study-specific audit tool was developed, which was based on available tools. And just looking at the main results from this. So moving ahead. And that's just the sensory audit itself displayed. So in the digital environment, people spoke about concerns related to predictability and logic of the layout. Again, this is digital, sensory overload relating to color, layout, and pattern symbols, lack of specific content functionality that accommodates neurodiversity, unnecessary content, typeface not easy to read, and inconsistency in the use of accessibility features on Brightspace. Brightspace is the learning management system which UCD use. And in terms of the physical environment, that slide appears to be missing. But in terms of the physical environment, certainly people spoke of challenges around wayfinding in particular. Wayfinding was a big issue for people. Other issues in the physical environment was the use of particular types of lighting. Also, the noise which can be generated when classes break on the hour. It's something which certainly was very jarring for many people identifying as neurodistinct, and how white spaces could be integrated into the design and into the structure of buildings was something people spoke passionately about. The other piece which people reflected upon was, apart from acoustics, was lighting. Some people found too much light to be quite oppressive. Some people found too much daylight, in fact, even to be uncomfortable and creating a jarring sensory experience. Also, from an olfactory or smell perspective, some people were particularly sensitive to the smells from canteens and food preparation areas. So in terms of wider recommendations, there's a number. I think there was approximately 31 recommendations in total. And we see here just flicking through them. A whole host of different recommendations. These ones on slide number 5 relate to staff-specific resourcing, recruitment, having more coaching opportunities for employees. Just if you want to return to the previous slide, Beth. Looking at how we can attract neurodivergent students. In Ireland, there is a scheme called the DARE scheme. So to see how this can give more visibility to neurodiversity. Looking again at the accommodations structure, reasonable accommodations, can that be improved? The extenuating circumstances where people may be applying for extensions, or where people might have circumstances which prevented them from submitting coursework, that already has been reviewed, actually. That's work which is ongoing. And then just on the previous slide again. So again, to look at the sensory spaces, to embed sensory physical design principles into new buildings on campus. And again, this is why approaches need to be interdisciplinary. And I know there's a lot of good work happening in the School of Architecture in UCD, and also in some leading design firms, but clearly this will be very important moving forward for new builds and any renovations happening. And then, of course, looking again at the virtual environment, and I know there's a lot of different learning management systems and there's a lot of different software packages, but again, how can these be improved? Just looking back to the previous slide. And then there are a number of student-specific recommendations, and clearly access to that diagnostic assessment. In certain respects, this is beyond the remit necessarily of a university. It's something more broadly in the public health service and indeed private health service. How can it be improved upon? In Ireland, in the child and adolescent sector, we now have community network disability teams. We have child and adolescent mental health services. And I think the more, I guess, interoperability between these services and the more, I guess, integration of these services would be important to facilitate access to diagnosis. So I think really that's all I want to say at the moment on the study. There is, of course, a published report, and perhaps Beth may be able to forward that to you with the presentation. But I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and if anybody has questions, I'm sure Ken.
Well, actually, my first question was, well, thanks for that. Just to say, and just thanks to Timmy for doing the presentation. I know it was 66 slides long, and to get through 66 slides long in a concise manner in 50 minutes is very impressive. So thank you for that. But obviously, the first question is probably for Beth or Sandra, and it is what you were alluding to there at the end, because the first question came in from Michelle was, how do you get a copy of the research? I have my copy here. Have it at home, read it every night. So if anybody doesn't get a copy of the research or the report, where would you find that? I don't know, Sandra or Beth might be able to help us on that.
I think, Emer, is it online? Is it on the Patreon website? On the EDI website?
Yeah, it's on the UCD EDI webpage. I'll put a link to it in the chat now.
Thanks, Millie.
Just to run through some more questions just that are coming in there. So if anybody does have any questions for anybody who's involved in the project, please drop them into the Q&A, and we have 10-15 minutes we'll be more than happy to go through them as quickly as we can. And the first one is coming in there from Gabby, and she's saying, as a student with both care responsibilities and an ND brain, I'm very grateful that you raised the potential for similarities and accommodations for both. Would you say that many universities might be more willing to support accommodating infrastructure if these overlaps are highlighted more? And I think, Timmy, you were making that point earlier in your presentation there when you talked about, obviously people with ND, but the way Dublin's gone in the last 5-10 years, getting to anywhere at 9 o'clock in the morning is a challenge. It's a bigger challenge when you have ND. So how do you see those overlapping into the future?
Sure. Well, an area which people have been focusing on more, in my experience, in the last 5 years, but I would suggest even longer than that, is the concept of intersectionality and how, difference, are indeed some protected characteristics or discrimination. If we were to talk about discrimination, for example, we know there are different types of inequalities. Inequalities sometimes can be related to race, to gender, just two that spring to mind. And of course, how disability, for example, and I don't really like to use the word disability because I know with neurodiversity, we don't really use the word disability necessarily. Some people do, some people don't. So I think it's important to say that. Many people wouldn't view neurodifference as a disability, but if we were to use that term, certainly how stigma or discrimination can interact, can sometimes compound issues, and definitely one of the challenges within the university sector is that many universities will want to provide a campus-based experience. And of course, the campus-based experience is important because a lot of learning happens, outside of lectures. It's in those different interactions that people might have together or those chance encounters that they might have. But there's no doubt about it, but that not everybody can be physically in a certain location at a certain time. And the question is, how can bespoke solutions be built in a way which is equitable for everybody? And I actually don't have the answer to that. I must say I don't really know, but it certainly is something which has come up separately in relation to people who have caring responsibilities, and how that can sometimes impact on their opportunity to engage in higher education. So I wouldn't have the answer for it, Ken.
No.
But I do think, if universities or employers really want to embrace inclusivity, we all need to be looking at how we can have bespoke solutions which are equitable, so that people who, whether a person is neurotypical, neuroatypical, it doesn't really matter, but that everyone would have an equal chance to actually participate. Sorry, I don't have a better answer to you.
I don't know. Does Emma want to jump in there before we go to the next question, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's certainly one of the roles we have, and it came out in the recommendations, particularly around, say, employers and managers, is how we train them to recognize that piece around diversity, that it's intersectional, and it cuts across a lot of areas and different types of diversity. So certainly one of our key recommendations or overarching ones is to look at that intersectional aspect, and there is a job of work to support managers around recognizing that that their team, they need to provide flexibility to their team in that context. So that can cut across areas like employees with caring responsibilities, or if they're neurodivergent, or whatever that might be.
Thanks. This is an interesting question. It's a little bit spicy, and I like that. And we do that on the here. So, what happens to those students that drop out because of the failure of universities to adjust their practices to realities and common sense? And again, just a little bit of background behind that. Forgive me for mentioning Trinity here as well, but they also did some research recently on making Trinity and ADHD friendly. One of the things, the statistics in that was that for neurotypical students, about 17% drop out after year one. For ADHD students, it can be up to 50%. So again, the challenge, what we're saying here is that, the university system, not only in Ireland and worldwide, is probably failing people with ND. So how are we going to resolve that? If that's not too big a question to be solved in the next 5 minutes. Did you unmute there, Timmy? Yep.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I remember I was at the launch of the report, and I took a little break for a few minutes for a glass of water, and I was just sitting in the lobby, and I was speaking to someone who did actually feel let down and felt that, things hadn't worked out for them in the way that they would have wanted in relation to their studies. And thankfully, the person was able to follow up with relevant supports. But I think the point is that I always look at things also with a historical lens, and I'm reminded of a quote, from one person from, I think, the qualitative work, and they told me that 20 years ago, 2004. Now, 2004 was actually a very modern time. We can probably all remember it. 2004 was not, some yesteryear from uninformed, unenlightened times. But they said how, in respect of dyslexia, they had been attending a university. It wasn't necessarily this one, but that I think an assistant professor or faculty, whoever it might have been, said to them, university is no place for a person with dyslexia. Now, that was 2004. I'm confident that you wouldn't hear that type of terminology now. In fact, the person spoke about their experience of coming to university in 2024 and found that there had been a paradigm shift. They found that the assistive technology, they found that attitudes, not just in the university, but also out in professional practice, had changed, and that they were welcomed, they were accommodated, they were supported. So I don't view change as an overnight thing. I look at it in blocks of decades, and I say, where will we be, by 2035? So I think what we need to do is we need to implement faithfully and with high fidelity the recommendations of this report, not just in UCD. These could be potentially transferable to other organizations, and to look at again, are we providing enough assisted technologies? Are we providing that, again, just one thing, that peer and professional mentorship? If the evidence seems to be stating that people are getting into difficulty at critical junctures, at times of change, at times of increased stress. So what are the critical junctures? Well, when you're moving from year to year is a critical juncture, when you're starting a new year, and also when you're doing your exams. So it seems to me that if there were to be targeted, very specific, and I know this involves resourcing, this does involve investment, but targeted supports at examination time and at perhaps the start of the year, we could see less people withdrawing, from their programs. So I think initiatives like that could make a difference, and many other initiatives. So it's about, implementing them, not just in UCD, but in other organizations as well.
Okay, thanks. Just there was another question in, it is marked for Timmy, but I'll probably throw this at Sandra. And it's just following up to what Timmy was talking about there, and it was saying, what are the plans to follow up on the study? Because say, let's be honest, Sandra, you're the person that pulled the research together, and then maybe we just go to Emer then for the what accommodations will be available in UCD today.
Yeah. I suppose I was thinking about the answers there as well that Timmy had mentioned just on the previous question, kind of links with both as well. And, I suppose the fact that while we might not have those exact numbers like you've mentioned, but other universities around attrition, I suppose one of the key purposes of, or I suppose one of the outcomes with the creating a more neurodiversity campus You know, here at UCD, what we would hope is that it will have an impact for students who are there currently. I know that it's really unfortunate. I know that the question there had been about students who have already dropped out because of a lack of these things, but we'd hope that from what the research has highlighted and the recommendations that have come from it, that will hopefully, while it doesn't address those people who've previously gone through this, that we would just hope that it would change the experience for people who are currently in the education system. You know, where we've seen a lot of, I suppose, a lot of our findings focus around the fact that there are actually a number of good initiatives already at play at the university, but that there is a disconnect between, you know, some of the things that are available and the awareness of these. So I think with the recommendations, we'll see a big push on things that are already in place for people and trying to bring the visibility of that more as well, which I hope will be one of the follow-ups to the study as well. But we've seen a lot around in terms of people having awareness, and also, you know, people's experiences in terms of believing it will impact career progression, believing that there is a need for reasonable accommodation specific to neurodiversity as well. And what we'd hope to see happening now, and with the follow-up to the study is, I suppose that Emer, you actually might be better able to speak to this one on me. I know obviously that the employee network was launched on the day that the university, that the report was launched as well. And we know then that there will be a further action group who will take the recommendations, because I suppose we do recognise there are a lot of recommendations, you know, a wide ranging number of them, and they will have to be looked at by the next action group to sort of, I suppose, prioritise them and to see, I suppose, what can be actioned more efficiently and quickly, and then I suppose we'll see what comes from there in terms of the follow-up, looking at the feasibility of the different, I suppose, and I know I need to be brief here as well, but we can see that there is a role, with some of the previous questions as well about the intersectionality. There are a number of things that can just be done in general to make the university experience for students and staff more accessible in general, and that they would have benefit for everybody. Part of that would be around universal design, and you know, things that lecturers can do to make education more accessible. But then there's also the more bespoke things that can be done on an individualized level that we can't lose, which are really, really important for helping people to continue to engage with their education. But in terms of other follow-up, Emer, I don't know whether you might be able to.
Yeah,
Give the final word to Emer.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Sandra mentioned that we're going to be establishing a new subgroup, a neurodiversity subgroup under our equality, diversity and inclusion group, and that'll be to take the recommendations and translate them into action. And I think one of the really positive, I guess, outcomes of the research, as well as the recommendations, was the opportunity to engage with so many stakeholders across the university, both students and employees, and the various student-facing units and departments that support them, and also for employees. So we've really built capacity and awareness across the university by doing that. So when it comes to the subgroup, I feel like we've got really good buy-in as well now to work with them around those recommendations. And those departments and stakeholders also contributed to the development of those recommendations. So you'll see in the report that there, at the back of the report, there's a kind of a showcase that spotlights some of the really positive work that's underway in UCD as well. So there's a piece around teaching and learning assessment modules that are more flexible and inclusive for students. So they provide kind of a flexible modes, I guess, around modules, so and how they're assessed, which is a really positive piece of work that the teaching and learning unit have been working on. It also looks at the reasonable accommodation process as well, and particularly for employees, how we can promote that more and ensure that employees are aware that neurodiversity supports are included within that. There's also lots of work that's been underway as well around the UCD Festival being neurodiversity inclusive, and there's lots of work around recruitment and training as well, so supporting hiring managers as well around that. So I think, as Sandra said, there is a very positive kind of findings within the report, but also there's kind of our recommendations that we need to focus on. So that subgroup will be starting in the next academic term in September, and then we'll be looking to put it into action. So hopefully the next time we'll see you, we'll be talking more about how we translated those recommendations into action.
Oh, you're just
Sorry,
on mute
on mute
there.
myself. Yep.
And
Just say, well, thanks to everybody for coming along. And just say the next one, actually, Beth has the slide on the next one. There you go, well timed. So the next one coming up is on the 27th of June. We'll have Dr. Sinead Rhodes from University, and understanding and supporting neurodivergent children and young people using the psychoeducation-based program. So that's coming up. You can book that through Eventbrite. So just want to say thanks to Emer, to Sandra, to Timmy, and obviously for Beth for keeping us all together. We have just ran a little bit over time. And again, thanks to everybody putting in questions. Sorry we haven't got to everybody's questions. And this tends to be a little bit of a feature. We might have to consider running to 75 or even 90 minutes for next year. But so thank you very much for coming along today. Hope you found it useful. And we look forward to seeing at this and future events that we have coming up for you in the near future.